In the shadowy corridors of Windermere Palace, where centuries of secrets lie buried beneath marble floors and golden tapestries, one piece of forgotten surveillance footage was about to shatter the fragile peace of the royal family forever. What the security guards discovered in the abandoned tunnel system would expose a web of lies so devastating that it would make Prince Alexander question everything he thought he knew about the woman who had become his stepmother. Sometimes the truth isn't just painful, it's explosive. The storm clouds gathered over Windermere Palace like an omen, casting long shadows across the manicured gardens where peacocks wandered freely among ancient oak trees. Prince Alexander stood at the towering windows of the East Wing, his hands clasped behind his back, as he watched the groundskeepers hurry to secure the outdoor furniture before the approaching tempest arrived. At 34, he carried himself with the practiced dignity of someone born to rule. Yet today there was an unusual tension in his shoulders that spoke of troubles beyond mere weather. The palace had been his sanctuary since childhood, its vast corridors and hidden passages serving as both playground and refuge during the darker days following his mother's tragic death 15 years ago. Queen Isabella had been the heart of the kingdom, beloved by her people and adored by her family. Her sudden passing in that terrible car accident had left a void that seemed impossible to fill until his father, King Edmund, had found love again with Lady Victoria Ashworth. Victoria had entered their lives like a breath of fresh air 3 years after Isabella's death. She was sophisticated, charming, and possessed a warmth that gradually melted the ice that had settled around the grieving king's heart. Alexander had been 19 then, old enough to understand his father's need for companionship, yet young enough to resist the idea of anyone replacing his beloved mother. Victoria had been patient with his coldness, never pushing too hard, always maintaining a respectful distance while slowly proving her genuine care for both the king and his son. The wedding had been a grand affair, watched by millions around the world. Victoria had looked radiant in her flowing silk gown, her auburn hair crowned with his grandmother's diamond tiara. Alexander had walked her down the aisle himself, having finally accepted her place in their family. She had asked him personally to give her away, saying she wanted his blessing more than anything else in the world. That gesture had meant everything to him, and from that day forward he had truly considered her his stepmother, not just his father's wife. For 12 years, Victoria had been a steady presence in the palace. She had modernized many of the royal charities, brought fresh energy to state functions, and had even helped Alexander navigate the complex world of royal duties as he prepared for his future role as king. She had been there when he graduated from Oxford, when he completed his military service, and when he had struggled through his own romantic disappointments. In many ways, she had become the mother figure he thought he had lost forever. This morning, however, everything felt different. Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. It had started 3 days ago when the palace security team had begun their annual inspection of the building's extensive infrastructure. Windermere Palace was a sprawling complex, built over several centuries with layers of additions and modifications that created a maze-like interior few people truly understood completely. Chief Security Officer Marcus Rothwell had mentioned during the morning briefing that they would be examining some of the older tunnel systems that ran beneath the palace. These tunnels dated back to the 17th century and have been used for various purposes over the years: smuggling routes during wartime, servant passages, and storage areas. Most had been sealed off decades ago for safety reasons, but the security team needed to ensure they remained secure and hadn't been compromised. Alexander had thought little of it at the time. The palace was constantly undergoing some form of maintenance or security review. It was part of life in a building that served as both a home and a symbol of the monarchy. But something in Rothwell's expression had seemed odd, almost uncomfortable, as if he knew something he wasn't sharing. The prince turned away from the window as thunder rumbled in the distance. He had been restless all morning, unable to concentrate on his usual duties. His private secretary had rescheduled 2 meetings already. Noting that His Royal Highness seemed distracted, Alexander rarely let anything interfere with his responsibilities. But today he felt as if he were waiting for something, though he had no idea what. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Rothwell. "Your Royal Highness, we need to speak privately. It's urgent. My office in 1 hour." Alexander stared at the message, his unease deepening. Rothwell was not one for dramatics. The man had served in the Special Forces before joining the Royal Protection Unit, and his communication was always direct and professional. If he said something was urgent, it was serious. The prince made his way through the familiar corridors of the palace, passing portraits of his ancestors and priceless works of art that had been collected over centuries. Servants bowed respectfully as he passed, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing with possibilities. Had there been a security breach? A threat against the family? Or was it something else entirely? Rothwell's office was located in the basement level of the palace, in what had once been part of the original medieval foundation. It was a practical space, filled with monitors showing feeds from hundreds of security cameras placed throughout the palace grounds. Maps of the building covered one wall, marked with various security zones and access points. The security chief was waiting for him, standing behind his desk with an expression that Alexander had never seen before. Rothwell looked genuinely troubled, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like dread. "Your Royal Highness, thank you for coming so quickly," Rothwell began, gesturing for Alexander to take a seat. "What I'm about to show you is difficult. I want you to know that I debated whether to bring this to your attention at all. But my duty is to the crown and to you personally." Alexander felt his pulse quicken. "Just tell me what's happened, Marcus." Rothwell moved to one of his computer terminals and began typing. "As you know, we've been inspecting the old tunnel systems. Most of them are empty, just storage spaces full of dust and forgotten furniture. But we found something in the north tunnel, the one that runs beneath the guest wing. It's a section that was supposedly sealed off 20 years ago." The screen came to life, showing grainy black and white footage. Alexander could see it was from a security camera, though the timestamp showed it was from 15 years ago. The image quality was poor, typical of older surveillance equipment, but he could make out a tunnel-like space with stone walls and what appeared to be some kind of meeting area with chairs and a small table. "We found an old surveillance system that had been installed in that tunnel back in the 90s, Rothwell continued, his voice careful and measured. "It was part of a security upgrade, but when that section was sealed, everyone forgot about it. The system kept recording to a hidden server that we only discovered when we were checking the electrical systems." Alexander leaned forward, studying the screen. "What am I looking at?" "Footage from the night Queen Isabella died, sir." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs as the significance of what Rothwell was telling him began to sink in. "That's impossible. Mother died in a car accident. She was returning from a charity event in London." "Yes, sir. But according to this footage, she made a stop here at the palace first. A stop that was never reported or recorded in the official timeline of that evening." Rothwell pressed another key, and the footage began to play. Alexander watched in stunned silence as figures moved through the tunnel space. The image quality made it difficult to make out faces clearly, but he could see two people, a woman in what appeared to be a dark coat, and another figure whose identity was obscured by shadows. "We've enhanced the footage as much as possible," Rothwell said quietly. "The woman is definitely Queen Isabella. We've verified it through multiple sources, including the distinctive jewelry she was wearing that evening, pieces that were confirmed to be on her person when the accident occurred." Alexander felt his hands beginning to shake. "And the other person?" Rothwell hesitated, his finger hovering over the keyboard. "That's what makes this so difficult, sir. The other person is... it's Lady Victoria." The room seemed to spin around Alexander. He gripped the arms of his chair, trying to process what he was hearing. "That's impossible. Victoria didn't even know my mother well at that time. They had met perhaps twice at official functions." "I know, sir. That's what makes this footage so troubling. According to all official records, Lady Victoria was at her country estate that evening, attending a small dinner party with friends. We've checked the alibis from that night, and they all confirm she was there. But this footage clearly shows her in the palace tunnel system, meeting with Queen Isabella just hours before the accident." The timestamp on the video showed 10:47 p.m. Alexander knew from the accident investigation that his mother's car had crashed at approximately 11:30 p.m. on a dark stretch of road between London and the palace. She had been alone, returning from the charity gala, when her vehicle had apparently veered off the road and struck a tree. The investigation had concluded it was a tragic accident, possibly caused by fatigue or a moment's inattention. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, sir. You're the first person to see it besides myself and one technician who helped with the enhancement. The technician has signed a confidentiality agreement and has been temporarily reassigned to another detail." Alexander stared at the frozen image on the screen, his mind reeling with questions and implications. Why would his mother have met secretly with Victoria? What could they have possibly had to discuss that couldn't have been handled through normal channels? And why had Victoria never mentioned this meeting to anyone, not even during the investigation into Isabella's death? "There's more, sir," Rothwell said reluctantly. "The meeting appears to have been heated. While we can't make out the specific words, the body language suggests it was not a friendly conversation." As if to demonstrate his point, Rothwell advanced the footage slightly. Even through the poor image quality, Alexander could see the tension in the two women's postures. His mother appeared to be gesturing emphatically, while Victoria remained very still, almost rigid. How long did the meeting last? Approximately 23 minutes. Queen Isabella left first, and Lady Victoria remained for several more minutes before departing to a different exit. Alexander felt sick. Everything he thought he knew about the night his mother died was crumbling around him. The official story had been so simple, so clear. Isabella had attended her charity function, said goodbye to friends and colleagues, and begun the drive home. The accident had been a cruel twist of fate, a moment when the demands of royal duty had extracted the ultimate price. But now there was this missing piece, this secret meeting that no one had known about. What had his mother and Victoria discussed in that tunnel? Why the secrecy? And why had Victoria never mentioned it, not even when she became part of their family? Sir, Rothwell said gently, I need to ask what you want to do with this information. This is obviously very sensitive material. It could raise questions about the original investigation, about Lady Victoria's current position in the family, about many things. Alexander stood up abruptly, pacing to the far wall where maps and diagrams showed every inch of the palace's security systems. He felt as if he were seeing the building with new eyes, recognizing that its familiar walls had been hiding secrets that could change everything. I need time to think, he said finally. I need to understand what this means before we take any action. Of course, sir. The footage is secure, and I can assure you it will remain confidential until you decide how to proceed. Alexander nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead to the confrontation he knew was inevitable. For 12 years, he had trusted Victoria completely. She had become more than just his father's wife. She had become family. The thought that she might have been hiding something so significant, something connected to his mother's death, was almost unbearable. As he left Rothwell's office, Alexander felt the weight of the palace's history pressing down on him more heavily than ever before. How many other secrets were hidden in these walls? How many other truths had been buried beneath years of official statements and carefully constructed narratives? The storm outside had arrived in full force, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling through the ancient stones. It seemed fitting somehow, as if the very building were reflecting the turmoil that now raged in Alexander's heart. By tomorrow, he knew, nothing would ever be the same again. The prince made his way back to his private apartments, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. With each step, one question pounded in his mind with increasing intensity. What had Victoria been doing in that tunnel with his mother, and why had she spent 12 years lying about it? Alexander spent the night staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, sleep eluding him completely. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the grainy footage of his mother and Victoria in that tunnel, their body language suggesting a confrontation that no one had ever known about. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the palace grounds glistening with raindrops. But the tempest in Alexander's mind had only grown stronger. He had always prided himself on being rational and methodical, qualities that served him well in his royal duties. But this situation demanded more than logic. It required him to confront the possibility that someone he loved and trusted had been living a lie for more than a decade. The very foundation of his relationship with Victoria was now in question, and he wasn't sure how to process that reality. At dawn, Alexander made a decision. He needed to see the tunnel for himself, to stand in the space where his mother had spent her final hours at the palace. Perhaps being there would help him understand what had happened, or at least prepare him for the conversation he would eventually have to have with Victoria. He dressed quickly in casual clothes and made his way to the basement levels of the palace. The corridors here were narrower, with lower ceilings and stone walls that spoke of the building's medieval origins. He had played in these passages as a child, but they felt different now, darker, more ominous, as if they were keeping secrets from him. Rothwell was already waiting near the entrance to the north tunnel, having anticipated that Alexander would want to investigate further. The security chief had brought powerful flashlights and had already disabled the temporary barriers that had been placed across the tunnel entrance. The entrance was hidden behind what appeared to be a solid wall, Rothwell explained as they walked into the tunnel. It's an ingenious piece of construction. From the outside, you'd never know there was a passage here. Someone went to considerable trouble to keep this space secret. The tunnel stretched for about 50 feet before opening into a larger chamber. Alexander could see why it had been chosen for clandestine meetings. It was completely isolated from the main palace, accessible only through a complex series of passages that few people knew existed. The air was stale and cold, carrying the mustiness of a space that had been sealed for 2 decades. In the center of the chamber, just as he had seen in the footage, were 2 chairs and a small table. They looked ordinary enough, but Alexander felt a chill as he realized his mother had sat in one of those chairs on the last night of her life. What had brought her here? What had been so urgent or so secret that it couldn't wait for a normal meeting? "Have you been able to enhance the audio at all?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Unfortunately, no. The recording system was video only. Whatever Queen Isabella and Lady Victoria discussed, we'll never know the specific words. Alexander walked slowly around the chamber, trying to imagine the scene. His mother had been wearing her formal gown from the charity event, complete with the Ashworth diamond tiara that had been in the family for generations. Victoria had been dressed more casually, suggesting she had come here directly from her supposed dinner party at her country estate. "The timing troubles me most," Alexander said, thinking aloud. Mother left the charity event at approximately 10:15 p.m. The drive to the palace should have taken her about 20 minutes. But the timestamp on the footage shows the meeting starting at 10:47 p.m. That means she came straight here after the event. "Yes, sir. And according to the footage, she left this chamber at 11:10 p.m. The accident occurred at 11:30 p.m., which would have given her just enough time to reach that stretch of road where the crash happened."
Alexander felt his chest tighten.
The timeline was perfect, too perfect. His mother had left this secret meeting and driven straight to her death. Was it possible that whatever had happened in this chamber had somehow contributed to the accident? Had she been upset, distracted, or emotionally compromised when she got behind the wheel? "Sir," Rothwell said carefully, "there's something else you should know. We've run a preliminary analysis of the accident site records from that night. The official investigation concluded that Queen Isabella simply lost control of her vehicle, but there were some elements that were never fully explained." "What kind of elements?" "The angle of the crash, for one thing. The car left the road at a very specific point, almost as if the driver had been distracted by something at a precise moment. There were also no skid marks, which suggests that the Queen didn't attempt to brake before hitting the tree." Alexander felt the ground shifting beneath him again. The official investigation had been thorough, he knew that, but investigations were only as good as the information they had access to. No one had known about this secret meeting, so no one had considered whether it might have affected his mother's state of mind during the drive home. "Are you suggesting the accident might not have been accidental?" Rothwell was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not suggesting anything, sir. I'm simply presenting facts that weren't available during the original investigation. What happened here that night might have been completely innocent. Perhaps Queen Isabella and Lady Victoria were planning some kind of surprise or discussing a private matter that they felt needed discretion. But the fact that it was never reported, combined with the timing," he didn't need to finish the thought. Alexander understood the implications perfectly. At best, Victoria had been keeping a significant secret for 12 years. At worst, he didn't want to consider what the worst-case scenario might be. They spent another hour in the tunnel, with Rothwell showing Alexander how the hidden camera system had worked and explaining how the footage had been preserved. The technology was primitive by today's standards, but it had been state-of-the-art in the early 2000s. Someone had invested considerable resources in monitoring this space, which raised additional questions about who else might have known about its existence. When they finally returned to the main palace, Alexander felt as if he were seeing the building with completely different eyes. Every corridor, every room, every familiar space now seemed to hold the potential for hidden secrets. How many other things didn't he know about his own home, his own family? He spent the morning in his office, trying to focus on his normal duties but finding his concentration shattered. His private secretary brought him correspondence to review, briefing papers for upcoming engagements, and requests for royal patronage that required his attention. But his mind kept returning to that grainy footage, to the image of his mother and Victoria in intense conversation just hours before Isabella's death. By afternoon, Alexander knew he could delay no longer. He needed to confront Victoria directly, but he also needed to approach the situation carefully. If there was an innocent explanation for what he had seen, he didn't want to damage their relationship unnecessarily. But if there was something more sinister, he needed to be prepared for that possibility as well. Victoria was in the blue drawing room when he found her, reviewing plans for an upcoming state dinner. She looked up with a smile when he entered, her face showing the warmth and affection that had characterized their relationship for more than a decade. "Alexander, darling," she said, setting aside her papers. "You look troubled. Is everything all right?" For a moment, he almost lost his resolve. This was the woman who had comforted him during difficult times, who had celebrated his successes and supported him through challenges. The idea that she might have been deceiving him all these years seemed impossible, but then he remembered his mother's face in the footage. The tension in her posture, the way she had gestured so emphatically during their conversation. Whatever had happened in that tunnel had been important enough for Isabella to detour from her journey home. Important enough to risk her safety on dark roads late at night. "Victoria," he said, sitting down across from her. "I need to ask you about something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe wariness. "Of course.
What is it?"
I need you to tell me about the last time you saw my mother alive." Victoria's expression didn't change, but Alexander caught a subtle shift in her breathing, a slight tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there a moment before.
"You know when that was, darling."
"It was at the Hendersons' garden party, about 3 weeks before the accident. Your mother and I chatted briefly about the upcoming charity season." "Think carefully, Victoria. Are you sure that was the last time you saw her?" Now, there was definitely something different in her demeanor. Her smile became more fixed, less natural, and she folded her hands in her lap in a gesture that Alexander recognized as a defensive posture. "I'm quite sure, yes." "Why are you asking me this?" "It was 15 years ago, Alexander. What could possibly matter now?" He studied her face carefully, looking for any sign of deception. Victoria had always been good at maintaining her composure. It was one of the qualities that made her such an effective royal consort. But Alexander had known her for a long time, and he could sense that something was wrong. "The palace security team has been inspecting the old tunnel systems," he said, watching her reaction carefully. "They found some interesting things." Victoria's face remained composed, but Alexander noticed that her knuckles had whitened slightly where her hands were clasped together. "What kind of things?" "Surveillance footage from 15 years ago. Footage that shows my mother in one of those tunnels on the night she died." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Victoria's face had gone very still, like a mask that had suddenly frozen in place. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "I see. And what does this footage show?" "It shows my mother meeting with someone in secret, just hours before her death. Someone who was supposed to be somewhere else entirely that evening." Victoria stood up abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the palace gardens. With her back to him, Alexander couldn't see her expression, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself rigid as if preparing for a blow. "Victoria," he said quietly, "I know it was you." She remained silent for a long time, staring out at the gardens where peacocks wandered among the rose bushes. When she finally turned around, her face was composed again, but there was something different in her eyes, a hardness that Alexander had never seen before. "What exactly do you think you know, Alexander?" The question surprised him. He had expected denials, explanations, perhaps tears. Instead, Victoria seemed to be challenging him, almost daring him to accuse her of something specific. "I know that you met with my mother secretly on the night she died. I know that you lied about your whereabouts that evening. I know that you've been keeping this secret for 15 years. His voice was rising despite his efforts to remain calm. "What I don't know is why." Victoria walked back to her chair but didn't sit down. Instead, she stood behind it, her hands gripping the back as if it were a shield. "And what do you think happened in that tunnel, Alexander? What terrible thing do you imagine I did?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "That's what I'm asking you to tell me." "And if I refuse?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Alexander felt something fundamental shift in their relationship in that moment. For the first time in their 12-year history, Victoria was not the warm, supportive stepmother who had helped raise him. She was something else entirely. Someone he didn't recognize and wasn't sure he could trust. "Then I'll have to assume the worst," he said quietly. Victoria smiled. But it wasn't the warm expression he remembered. The smile was cold, calculating, almost predatory. "The worst," she repeated. "And what would that be exactly? Do you think I somehow caused Isabella's accident? Do you think I murdered your mother, Alexander?" The words hung in the air like poison. Alexander felt as if he had been slapped. To hear such a possibility voiced out loud by Victoria herself made it seem both more real and more horrible than he had imagined. "I think," he said carefully, "that you owe me an explanation for why you've been lying to my family for 15 years. Victoria moved around the chair and sat down, her movements now deliberated and controlled. When she looked at him, her eyes held a coldness that made him feel as if he were looking at a stranger. "You want the truth, Alexander? Are you sure you're prepared for it? Because once I tell you what really happened that night, there won't be any going back. Your perfect memories of your sainted mother, your comfortable illusions about your family, all of that will be destroyed forever." Alexander felt his heart pounding, but he held her gaze steadily. "I want the truth." Victoria nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting this moment for years and was almost relieved that it had finally arrived. Very well, she said, but don't say I didn't warn you. The truth about that night is going to change everything you thought you knew about the people you love most in this world. Victoria stood up and moved to a sideboard where crystal decanters held various spirits. Her hands were steady as she poured herself a measure of brandy, but Alexander noticed she didn't offer him anything. The gesture felt like another wall going up between them, another sign that the comfortable familiarity of their relationship was crumbling. Your mother, Victoria began, still facing away from him, was not the saint you remember her to be. Alexander felt anger flare in his chest. Don't you dare? Don't I dare what? Victoria turned around, her eyes flashing. Don't I dare tell you the truth about Isabella? Don't I dare shatter your precious illusions about the perfect queen who died tragically young? She took a sip of brandy and sat back down, her composure now completely transformed. You wanted the truth, Alexander. This is it. The room felt charged with tension, like the air before a lightning strike. Alexander found himself gripping the arms of his chair, preparing for revelations that he sensed would reshape everything he thought he knew about his family. Isabella called me that evening, Victoria continued, her voice now steady and matter-of-fact. Around 9 o'clock, just as I was finishing dinner with friends at my country estate. She was frantic, desperate. She begged me to meet her at the palace immediately. Why would she do that? You barely knew each other. That's what you were always told, yes, but the reality was quite different. Victoria swirled the brandy in her glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. Isabella and I had been acquainted for much longer than anyone realized, since before she married your father, actually. Alexander felt the ground shifting beneath him again. That's impossible. The family history, the official records show what they were designed to show, Victoria interrupted. Your mother was very good at managing her public image, at controlling the narrative of her life. But the truth was considerably more complex. She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts, then continued in a voice that had grown distant, almost clinical. Isabel and I met at university. We were both at Cambridge, though in different years. She was studying art history, preparing for the role she would eventually play as a royal patron of the arts. I was reading politics and economics, planning a career in government or perhaps international relations. Alexander stared at her, trying to process this information. He had never heard Victoria mention anything about knowing his mother before the marriage. In all the years since she had joined the family, she had never once hinted at any prior relationship with Isabella. We became friends initially, Victoria continued. Isabella was brilliant, charming, and ambitious. She knew from an early age that she would likely marry into royalty. The match with your father was being discussed even then, though not yet formalized. She cultivated relationships carefully, understanding that every connection might prove valuable someday.
What are you saying?
I'm saying that your mother was not the naive young woman who accidentally caught the king's eye. She was a calculated strategist who orchestrated her own rise to power. Victoria's voice had grown harder, more bitter, and I was one of her tools in that process. Alexander felt sick. The woman Victoria was describing bore no resemblance to the loving, gentle mother he remembered. Isabella had been warm, spontaneous, and genuinely caring. She had tucked him into bed every night when she was at the palace, had listened patiently to his childhood fears and dreams, had made him feel special and loved even within the constraints of royal protocol. That's not true, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Isn't it? Victoria leaned forward, her eyes intense. Think about it, Alexander. How convenient was it that Isabella happened to be at exactly the right social events to meet your father? How fortunate that she had developed exactly the right interests and skills to appeal to him. How lucky that she possessed such deep knowledge of royal history and protocol, despite coming from a relatively minor noble family. She stood up again, beginning to pace the room like a caged animal. Isabella spent years preparing to become queen. She studied every aspect of royal life, cultivated relationships with influential people, and positioned herself perfectly for when the opportunity arose. I was part of that preparation.
How?
Victoria stopped pacing and faced him directly. I provided her with information about your father, about the palace, about the workings of the monarchy. My family had connections to the royal household going back generations. Distant connections, but enough to give me access to information that might prove useful. Alexander felt as if he were watching his childhood memories dissolve before his eyes. You're saying she used you to spy on my father? I'm saying she was thorough in her research. She wanted to understand exactly what she was getting into, what would be expected of her, how she could position herself to succeed. Victoria's voice carried a note of grudging admiration. It worked brilliantly. Your father was completely captivated by her. The brandy glass trembled slightly in Victoria's hand as she continued her story. For several years after the marriage, we maintained our friendship. I would visit occasionally, always discreetly, and Isabella would share the challenges and realities of royal life. She was adapting well to her new role, but she was also learning things about the monarchy that disturbed her. What kind of things? Financial irregularities, secret agreements with foreign governments, activities that could have been embarrassing or even damaging if they became public. Victoria's expression grew darker. Isabella discovered that your father and his advisors were not always as transparent or ethical as the public believed. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. His father had always been a principled man, devoted to duty and service. The idea that King Edmund might have been involved in questionable activities seemed impossible. What you have to understand, Victoria continued, is that Isabella was not content to simply be a decorative queen. She wanted to be a force for positive change, to use her position to address real problems and injustices. But when she tried to push for reforms or raise concerns about what she had discovered, she met with resistance from the established power structure. So she confided in you.
She did more than confide.
She began to document what she was learning. Names, dates, amounts, meetings. She kept detailed records of everything she discovered. She said it was insurance, a way to protect herself and her family if anyone ever tried to discredit her or remove her from her position. Victoria returned to her chair, but this time she sat on the edge, as if ready to flee at any moment. Over time, our relationship evolved. Isabella began to see me not just as a friend, but as someone who could help her navigate the dangerous waters she found herself in. Someone who understood politics and power dynamics, who could offer advice on how to handle delicate situations. And you were willing to do that? I cared about her, Victoria said simply. Despite everything that happened later, that was always true. I genuinely cared about Isabella and wanted to help her succeed. Alexander studied her face, trying to detect any sign of deception. But Victoria's expression was open now, almost vulnerable, as if telling this story was causing her pain. What changed, he asked. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, staring into her brandy glass as if it held answers she couldn't find anywhere else. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with a sadness that seemed to come from deep within her soul. She asked me to do something I couldn't do, something that would have compromised everything I believed in. What? She wanted me to help her bring down your father. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He'd literally felt the breath leave his lungs as the implications of what Victoria was telling him began to sink in. His mother plotting against his father, Isabella, the loving wife and devoted queen, secretly working to destroy the man she had married. That's impossible, he whispered. Is it? Victoria's voice was gentle now, almost pitying. Think about it, Alexander. By the time you were 18, your parents' marriage was already showing signs of strain. They were polite to each other in public, but there was no warmth between them anymore. Isabella had discovered things about your father that she couldn't forgive or ignore. Alexander's mind raced back through his teenage years, trying to remember the dynamics between his parents. It was true that they had seemed more formal with each other in the later years, but he had attributed that to the natural evolution of a long marriage combined with the pressures of royal life. She came to me about 6 months before her death, Victoria continued. She had compiled extensive evidence of financial improprieties involving several members of your father's inner circle. Illegal arms deals, money laundering operations, bribes from foreign governments. The scope of it was staggering. Even if any of that were true, why would she want to expose it? It would have damaged the monarchy itself. That's exactly what she wanted, Victoria said quietly. Isabella had become convinced that the institution needed to be torn down and rebuilt. She believed that only by exposing the corruption could the monarchy be purified and restored to its proper role. Victoria stood up again, walking to one of the portraits on the wall, a painting of Alexander's great-grandmother, who had ruled during World War II and was remembered as a symbol of strength and integrity. She showed me documents that would have destroyed your father's reputation permanently. Bank records, correspondence with questionable foreign officials, evidence of weapons sales to countries under international sanctions. She wanted me to help her release this information to the press, and you refused. I refused, Victoria confirmed, her back still turned to him. Not because I didn't believe the evidence. I had seen enough to know that at least some of it was true. I refused because I understood what the consequences would be. Not just for your father, but for you, for the monarchy, for the entire country. She turned around and Alexander was surprised to see tears in her eyes. Isabella was brilliant, but she was also idealistic to the point of naivety. She thought she could control what happened after the revelations came out. She believed she could guide the rebuilding process, create a new and better version of the monarchy with herself at the center. What did you tell her? I told her that destroying your father would destroy you as well, that bringing down the monarchy would create chaos that could take generations to resolve. I begged her to find another way, to work within the system to create change gradually rather than trying to burn everything down. Victoria wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. She accused me of betraying her, of choosing loyalty to the establishment over friendship with her. She said I was a coward who cared more about preserving my own position than doing what was right. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Alexander struggled to process everything he was hearing. The woman Victoria was describing, calculating, ruthless, willing to destroy her own husband for what she saw as the greater good, bore no resemblance to the mother he had loved and grieved for 15 years. The meeting in the tunnel, he said finally, was her last attempt to convince me, Victoria finished. She called me that evening in a panic. She said she had decided to move forward with her plan, with or without my help, but she wanted to give me one final chance to join her. And, Victoria's expression grew haunted. I drove to the palace as quickly as I could. I found her in that tunnel. She had chosen the location because she was paranoid about being overheard. She was different that night, Alexander. Desperate, almost manic. She said she couldn't wait any longer, that events were forcing her hand. What events? She had learned that your father's advisors suspected she was investigating them. She was afraid they would move against her if she didn't act first. Victoria's voice dropped to almost a whisper. She was terrified, Alexander. Not for herself, but for you. She was convinced that if she didn't strike first, you would be caught in the crossfire when the truth eventually came out. Alexander felt his world spinning around him. Nothing made sense anymore. The mother he remembered had been loving and protective, but she had never seemed frightened or desperate. She had never given any indication that she saw their family as being under threat. What happened in that meeting? Victoria closed her eyes, as if trying to block out a painful memory. I tried one more time to talk her out of it. I showed her projections of what would happen if she released her evidence. The constitutional crisis, the political chaos, the damage to Britain's international standing. I begged her to think about the consequences for you personally, but she wouldn't listen. She accused me of being part of the conspiracy. She said I had been compromised, that the establishment had gotten to me. She threatened to include me in her revelations, to paint me as another corrupt insider who had helped cover up your father's crimes. Victoria opened her eyes, and Alexander saw pain there that seemed to go soul deep. That's when I realized how far gone she was. The woman I had known and cared about for so many years was no longer rational. She was consumed by her mission, willing to destroy anyone who stood in her way, including me, including you, including herself. So what did you do? Victoria's voice became barely audible. I told her that if she went through with her plan, she would destroy everything she claimed to love. I told her that you would never forgive her for what she was about to do to your father, to your family's legacy. I told her that her actions would make you ashamed to be her son. Alexander felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. You said that to her? I was desperate, Victoria said, tears flowing freely now. I thought maybe if she understood the personal cost, she would reconsider. Instead, she broke off, unable to continue. Instead what? Victoria took a shaky breath. Instead, she looked at me with such hatred, such contempt. She said that I had proven myself to be exactly what she had suspected. A weak, selfish woman who cared more about her own comfort than justice. She said she was done with me, done with all of us. And then she left. She walked out of that tunnel, and 20 minutes later, she was dead. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander stared at Victoria, trying to process the enormity of what she had just told him. His mother hadn't died in a simple accident. She had died while fleeing from a confrontation that had shattered her relationship with one of her closest friends, while carrying secrets that could have destroyed the monarchy itself. Do you think she... Alexander couldn't finish the question. Victoria seemed to understand what he was trying to ask. Did she crash intentionally? I don't know, Alexander. I've wondered about that every day for 15 years. She was upset when she left, angry and hurt and possibly not thinking clearly. Whether what happened next was an accident or something else, I'll never know for sure. Alexander stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the window, staring out at the gardens without seeing them. Everything he thought he knew about his family, about his mother's death, about Victoria's place in their lives, had just been turned upside down. Why didn't you tell anyone? He asked without turning around. What was I supposed to say? That the beloved Queen Isabella had been planning to destroy the monarchy? That she had been gathering evidence against your father for years? That our last conversation had been a bitter argument that might have contributed to her death? Victoria's voice was hollow. Who would have believed me? And even if they had, what good would it have done? Alexander finally turned around. Victoria looked older somehow, as if telling this story had drained something vital from her. So you decided to bury it all. I decided to protect you, she said firmly. You were 19 years old, Alexander. You had just lost your mother in a tragic accident. I couldn't bear the thought of also destroying your memories of her, your relationship with your father, your faith in everything you had been raised to believe in. That wasn't your decision to make, perhaps not. But it was the decision I made, and I would make it again. Victoria's voice grew stronger, more defiant. I chose to let you keep your illusions about Isabella to preserve your ability to grieve for the mother you remembered rather than the woman she had become. And then you married my father. The accusation hung in the air between them. Victoria flinched as if she had been slapped. That happened much later, and it had nothing to do with what I knew about Isabella.
Didn't it?
You had information that could have destroyed him? That gave you power over him, leverage. No, Victoria said forcefully. It wasn't like that at all. Your father never knew what Isabella had discovered, or that I knew about it. When we began our relationship, it was genuine, based on mutual affection and shared grief over losing Isabella. Alexander studied her face, trying to determine if she was telling the truth. The Victoria he thought he knew would never have manipulated her way into the royal family. But then again, the Victoria he thought he knew wouldn't have kept such enormous secrets for 15 years either. I don't know what to believe anymore, he said quietly. Believe this, Victoria said, moving closer to him. I have spent 15 years trying to be the mother figure you needed, trying to honor Isabella's memory by taking care of the son she loved more than anything else in the world. Everything I have done since that night has been motivated by my love for you and your father. But you've been living a lie. I've been living with the truth, she corrected. There's a difference. Alexander turned away from her again, his mind reeling with questions and implications. If what Victoria was telling him was true, then his entire understanding of his family history was wrong. But was she telling him the truth? Or was this simply another layer of deception? Another story designed to manipulate him? I need proof, he said finally. What? If what you're telling me is true, if my mother really was gathering evidence against my father, then that evidence must still exist somewhere. I need to see it. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was reluctant. Isabella destroyed most of it before she died. She was paranoid about it being discovered. But not all of it? Another pause.
She gave me copies of some documents as insurance, she said.
In case something happened to her. Alexander turned back to face her, his expression intense. Where are they? Victoria looked as if she were about to be sick.
Alexander, please.
Seeing those documents won't change anything. Your mother is still dead. Your father has been a good king for the past 15 years. Why dig up old scandals that can't be undone? 'Cause I deserve to know the truth about my own family, he said firmly. All of it. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. But remember, you asked for this. And once you see what Isabella discovered, there won't be any going back to the comfortable illusions you've been living with.
Ooh.
She moved to a small writing desk in the corner of the room and opened a drawer that Alexander had never seen her access before. From it, she withdrew a manila envelope that looked as if it had been hidden there for years. These are photocopies of some of the documents Isabella showed me, she said, holding the envelope but not yet offering it to him. Bank records, correspondence, transaction details, proof of activities that would have ended your father's reign and possibly brought down the government. Alexander reached for the envelope, but Victoria pulled it back slightly. Once you look at these, everything changes, she warned. Your relationship with your father, your understanding of your mother, your view of the monarchy itself. Are you absolutely certain you want to know? Alexander met her gaze steadily. I'm certain. Victoria handed him the envelope. As his fingers closed around it, she said quietly, I'm sorry, Alexander. I'm sorry for all of it. As Alexander walked toward the door with the envelope in his hand, he heard Victoria call after him. There's one more thing you should know, she said. Isabella wasn't the only one who knew about your father's activities. There were others. Advisors, government officials, members of parliament. Some of them are still in positions of power today. Alexander stopped, his hand on the door handle. What are you saying? I'm saying that if you decide to pursue this, if you decide to expose what your mother discovered, you won't just be challenging your father's legacy, You'll be challenging a system that has protected itself for decades. And systems like that don't go down without a fight. Alexander left the room without responding, but Victoria's warning echoed in his mind as he walked through the corridors of the palace that had been his home for his entire life. In his hands, he carried evidence that might destroy everything he had ever believed about his family. Behind him, he left the woman who had been both stepmother and guardian of terrible secrets. As he reached his private apartments, Alexander realized that his world was about to change forever. The only question now was whether he would have the courage to face whatever truths were contained in that envelope. Alexander sat in his private study, staring at the manila envelope on his desk, as if it were a dangerous explosive that might detonate at any moment. The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rug that had been a gift from his mother on his 18th birthday. Everything in this room held memories of his childhood, of simpler times when the world had made sense and his family had been exactly what they appeared to be. He had been sitting here for over an hour, unable to bring himself to open the envelope. Part of him wanted to burn it, to destroy whatever evidence it contained and return to the comfortable illusions Victoria had accused him of living with. But he knew that was impossible now. The questions had been asked, the secrets had begun to emerge, and there was no path back to ignorance. With trembling fingers, he finally broke the seal on the envelope and removed the contents. What he found was a collection of photocopied documents, bank statements, correspondence, and what appeared to be transaction records. The papers were dated between 12 and 16 years ago, during the period when his mother had apparently been investigating his father's activities. The first document was a bank statement from an account Alexander had never heard of, registered under a series of shell companies but clearly connected to the royal household through coded references he was gradually able to decipher. The amounts involved were staggering, millions of pounds moving in and out of the account over a period of several months. As he studied the transaction patterns, Alexander began to understand what his mother had discovered. The money was flowing from sources that included several foreign governments, defense contractors, and what appeared to be private arms dealers. The funds were then being distributed through a complex network of accounts, some going to legitimate royal expenses, but others disappearing into investments and personal accounts that seemed to have no official oversight. The correspondence was even more damaging. Letters between his father and various government officials discussed agreements that appeared to bypass normal diplomatic channels. One exchange dealt with weapon sales to a country that Alexander knew had been under international sanctions at the time. Another involved what seemed to be a promise to use royal influence to secure favorable trade deals in exchange for substantial personal payments. But it was the final document that truly shattered Alexander's world. It was a letter in his father's handwriting, addressed to someone identified only as C. The date on the letter was just 3 weeks before his mother's death. See, Isabella's questions are becoming more persistent and pointed. She's been asking about the Meridian accounts and has somehow obtained information about the Kandahar situation. We may need to consider more direct intervention to protect our interests. The stakes are too high to allow sentiment to compromise operational security. Advise. Alexander read the letter 3 times before its implications truly sank in. His father had known that Isabella was investigating him. More than that, he had been considering taking action to stop her. The phrase "more direct intervention" sent a chill through Alexander's blood. What kind of intervention had his father been contemplating? He set the letter down with shaking hands and stared out the window at the gardens where he had played as a child. Everything Victoria had told him was true, and possibly worse than she had revealed. His mother hadn't just been planning to expose corruption. She had been in active danger from the very people she was trying to bring to justice. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside his study made Alexander quickly gather the documents and slip them back into the envelope. A moment later, there was a soft knock on his door. "Come in," he called, trying to keep his voice steady. To his surprise, it was his father who entered. King Edmund was still an imposing figure at 68, with silver hair and the bearing of a man who had carried the weight of the crown for more than 3 decades. But today, Alexander noticed something different in his father's expression. A wariness, almost a haunted quality that he had never seen before. "Alexander," the king said, closing the door behind him, "Victoria tells me you've been asking questions about your mother." Alexander felt his pulse quicken. How much did his father know about what had been discovered? How much had Victoria told him? "Yes," Alexander said carefully. "Some old surveillance footage was found during the security inspection. It raised questions about the timeline of events on the night Mother died." King Edmund moved to one of the leather chairs near the fireplace and sat down heavily. For a moment, he looked every one of his 68 years. "I see. And what questions might those be?" Alexander studied his father's face. looking for any sign of deception or guilt. But Edmund's expression was carefully neutral, revealing nothing. The footage shows that Mother was at the palace that evening meeting with someone in the old tunnel system, a meeting that was never reported during the accident investigation. I see, the king repeated. And who was this someone? Victoria. Edmund was quiet for a long moment, staring into the cold fireplace. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired. Your stepmother has always been protective of this family's privacy. Perhaps she felt that revealing the meeting would only add to the speculation and conspiracy theories that surrounded your mother's death. Or perhaps there was something else she was trying to hide. The king looked up sharply at that. What are you suggesting, Alexander? This was the moment of truth. Alexander could back down, pretend he had no other information, and allow the conversation to end without confronting his father directly. Or he could press forward, armed with the knowledge from his mother's documents, and demand answers. I'm suggesting that Mother may have discovered things that certain people didn't want her to know, Alexander said quietly. Something flickered in Edmund's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe fear. The mask of royal composure slipped slightly, revealing a man who suddenly looked older and more vulnerable than Alexander had ever seen him. What sort of things? Alexander reached for the envelope on his desk. His father's eyes tracked the movement, and Alexander saw recognition there. Edmund knew exactly what was in that envelope. Financial irregularities, unauthorized agreements with foreign governments, activities that could have compromised the integrity of the monarchy. Alexander's voice grew stronger as he spoke. Activities that Mother was planning to expose before her death. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Father and son stared at each other across the room, 34 years of love and trust hanging in the balance between them. Where did you get those documents? Edmund asked finally. Does it matter? What matters is that they exist and that they appear to be genuine. King Edmund stood up and walked to the window, his movements slow and deliberate. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. Your mother was a remarkable woman, Alexander. Intelligent, principled, determined to make the world a better place. But she was also idealistic to the point of naivety sometimes. So what she discovered wasn't true? What she discovered was complicated, Edmund said, still facing away from his son. The world of international relations, of maintaining Britain's influence and security, is not always as clean and straightforward as we might wish it to be. Alexander felt anger building in his chest. That sounds like a justification for corruption, does it? Edmund turned around, and Alexander was surprised to see genuine pain in his father's eyes. Let me ask you something, son. If you could prevent a terrorist attack by making an unofficial payment to someone who had the information you needed, would you do it? If you could save British lives by selling weapons to a country that officially couldn't purchase them, would you make that choice?
That's exactly what it is, Edmund interrupted.
The documents your mother found were evidence of decisions made to protect British interests and British lives. Were some of those decisions technically illegal? Yes. Were they morally questionable? Perhaps. But were they necessary? I believe they were. Alexander stared at his father, trying to reconcile the man he had always admired with the one who was now admitting to illegal activities. And the personal enrichment? The money that went into private accounts? Edmund's expression hardened. Every decision carries risks, Alexander. The people who help make those difficult decisions, who take on the legal and personal exposure, deserve to be compensated for those risks. That's not corruption. That's pragmatic reality. Mother didn't see it that way. No, Edmund said quietly. She didn't. Isabella believed that principles were more important than results, that the appearance of propriety was more valuable than actual security. She was willing to destroy everything we had built in order to maintain her perfect moral standards. Alexander felt the room spinning around him. His father was not denying the allegations. He was defending them. More than that, he seemed to be suggesting that Isabella's objections had been unreasonable. She was going to expose all of this, Alexander said. Yes, and in doing so, she would have compromised ongoing operations, endangered assets in the field, and potentially gotten people killed. Edmund's voice grew harder. She would have damaged Britain's relationships with crucial allies and handed our enemies a propaganda victory that would have taken decades to overcome. So you stopped her. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Edmund froze, his eyes locked on his son's face. What exactly are you asking me, Alexander? I'm asking if you had something to do with Mother's death. For a moment, Alexander thought his father might deny it, might express shock and outrage at such an accusation. Instead, Edmund walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. Your mother's death was a tragedy, he said carefully. An accident that robbed this family and this country of a remarkable woman. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're going to get, Edmund said firmly, because it's the only answer that matters. Alexander felt something break inside him. His father's non-denial was more devastating than an outright confession would have been. The implication was clear. Edmund had been involved in Isabella's death, but he would never admit it directly. How? Alexander whispered. How? What? How did you do it? How did you arrange for her car to crash at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place? Edmund was quiet for a long moment, studying his son's face. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a sadness that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. You want to know how the world really works, Alexander? You want to understand what it takes to protect a kingdom, to maintain the stability that allows millions of people to live their lives in peace and security? Alexander said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. There are people, Edmund continued, who specialize in solving problems that can't be solved through conventional means. People who understand that sometimes individual sacrifices must be made for the greater good. These people are very good at what they do, and they leave no traces of their work. The clinical, matter-of-fact way his father was describing his mother's murder made Alexander feel physically ill. This wasn't the passionate crime of a desperate man. It was the calculated elimination of a threat by someone who saw it as just another necessary business decision. She was your wife, Alexander said, his voice barely audible. She was also a danger to everything I had spent my life building, Edmund replied. I loved Isabella, Alexander. But love doesn't always trump responsibility. Alexander stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. You had her killed. You murdered my mother. I protected my country and my family from a woman who was about to destroy both, Edmund said calmly. History will judge whether that was right or wrong. History. Alexander's voice rose to nearly a shout. What about me? What about the fact that I've spent 15 years grieving for a woman who was murdered by her own husband? You've spent 15 years growing into the man you are today, free from the burden of knowing that your mother was planning to destroy everything you were raised to respect and protect. Edmund's voice remained steady, infuriatingly rational. Would you rather have grown up knowing that Isabella was willing to sacrifice you and your future for her abstract principles? Alexander felt tears streaming down his face, though he couldn't remember when he had started crying. She was trying to do the right thing. She was trying to salve her own conscience at the expense of everyone else's security, Edmund corrected. Isabella had become dangerous, Alexander, not just to me, but to you, to the monarchy, to the country itself. What I did was necessary. The word necessary echoed in Alexander's mind like a curse. How many times over the years had his father used that word to justify difficult decisions? How many other necessary actions had Edmund taken that Alexander knew nothing about? Does Victoria know? Alexander asked. Victoria suspects, Edmund said. She's intelligent enough to have put the pieces together over the years. But she also understands the importance of maintaining stability, of protecting what we've built together. Alexander thought about Victoria's tears earlier. Her obvious pain when she had told him about her final meeting with Isabella. Had she known even then what was going to happen? Had she been complicit in his mother's murder? What happens now? Alexander asked. Edmund leaned forward in his chair, his expression becoming more paternal. Now you have a choice to make, son. You can try to pursue justice for something that happened 15 years ago, knowing that doing so will destroy this family, damage the monarchy possibly beyond repair, and accomplish nothing except satisfying your need for revenge. Or you can accept that sometimes terrible decisions must be made for good reasons and focus on the future instead of the past. You're asking me to become complicit in covering up murder. I'm asking you to become a king, Edmund said firmly. Because that's what you will be someday. And kings must understand that the world is not the idealistic place your mother believed it to be. Kings must make hard choices, Alexander. They must sometimes choose the greater good over personal sentiment. Alexander stared at his father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in his life. This wasn't the noble, principled monarch he had grown up idolizing. This was a man who had arranged his wife's murder to protect his own interests, who had spent 15 years living with that secret, and who was now asking his son to do the same. I can't, Alexander whispered. You can't what? I can't pretend this never happened. I can't just accept that mother was murdered and move on as if nothing changed. Edmund's expression grew cold. Then what do you plan to do about it? Alexander looked down at the envelope containing his mother's evidence. In his hands he held the power to destroy his father, to expose the corruption Isabella had discovered, to finally give her the justice she had died seeking. But he also held the power to destroy everything else, his own future, the monarchy's stability, possibly even the country's security.
I don't know, he said honestly.
Well, Edmund said, standing up to leave, you had better figure it out quickly, because if you decide to pursue this course of action, there will be consequences. Not just for me, but for everyone involved, including Victoria. The threat was subtle but clear. If Alexander moved against his father, Victoria would be caught in the crossfire. The woman who had raised him, who had been both stepmother and guardian of terrible secrets, would pay the price for his quest for justice. Think carefully, Alexander, Edmund continued as he reached the door. Think about what your mother would really want for you. Would she want you to destroy your life and your future for the sake of punishing decisions that can't be undone? Or would she want you to learn from the past and focus on building a better future? After his father left, Alexander collapsed back into his chair, emotionally and physically drained. The envelope of evidence sat on his desk like a judgment waiting to be rendered. In a single afternoon, he had learned that his mother had been murdered by his father, that his stepmother had been keeping that secret for 15 years, and that he now faced an impossible choice between justice and stability. Outside his window, the sun was setting over the palace gardens, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. In a few hours, the family would gather for dinner, as they did every evening, maintaining the pretense of normalcy that had defined their lives for more than a decade. Victoria would ask about his day, his father would discuss affairs of state, and Alexander would sit at the table knowing that he was surrounded by people who had conspired to murder the woman who had given him life. The weight of the crown he would someday inherit had never felt heavier than it did in that moment, as Alexander sat alone with the terrible knowledge that would define the rest of his life. 3 weeks had passed since Alexander learned the truth about his mother's death, and each day had been a carefully orchestrated performance of normalcy. He attended meetings, fulfilled his royal duties, and maintained the facade of being the devoted son and heir that the public expected him to be. But beneath the surface, he was slowly unraveling. The envelope containing his mother's evidence had become both his obsession and his torment. He had memorized every document, every transaction, every piece of correspondence that proved his father's corruption and his mother's desperate attempt to expose it. At night, he would lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying his father's cold admission of murder, and wondering how many other secrets were hidden within the palace walls. Victoria had tried to speak with him several times, but Alexander found it impossible to look at her without seeing complicity in her eyes. She had known what Edmund was capable of, had suspected what might happen to Isabella, and had chosen to protect the institution rather than the woman she claimed to care about. Her tears and protestations of love felt hollow now, just another performance designed to maintain the fiction that they were a loving family. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when Alexander was reviewing briefing papers for an upcoming state visit. Among the documents was a routine security report that mentioned the need to neutralize potential threats to royal safety during the visit. The clinical language, so similar to what his father had used when describing Isabella's murder, triggered something inside Alexander that he couldn't control. He swept the papers off his desk, sending them scattering across the floor, and called for his private secretary. "Cancel my appointments for today," he said when the man appeared at his door. "I'm indisposed. Shall I reschedule them for tomorrow, Your Royal Highness? I'll let you know." After his secretary left, Alexander sat in his study and made a decision that would change everything. He picked up his secure phone and dialed a number he had memorized weeks ago, the direct line for investigative journalist Sarah Chen at The Guardian. Chen was known for her meticulous research and her willingness to pursue stories that other reporters might consider too dangerous or politically sensitive. "Miss Chen," he said when she answered, "this is Prince Alexander. I have a story for you, but we need to meet in person tonight." The pause on the other end of the line told him that Chen understood the magnitude of what he was suggesting. "Your Royal Highness," she said carefully, "are you certain about this?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." They arranged to meet at a small pub in East London, far from the usual haunts of the royal family or the press corps. Alexander spent the afternoon making preparations for what he knew would be the last day of his life as he had known it. He wrote letters to Victoria, to close friends, to the staff who had served him faithfully, explaining his decision and asking for their understanding. The most difficult letter was addressed to his father. In it, Alexander wrote, "You asked me to think about what Mother would have wanted for me. I believe she would have wanted me to have the courage to stand up for truth and justice, even when it comes at a personal cost. She died because she believed those principles were more important than personal comfort or institutional stability. I intend to honor that belief." As evening fell, Alexander disguised himself in casual clothes and left the palace through one of the service entrances, avoiding the usual security protocols. The drive to East London felt like a journey into another world, away from the gilded cage of royal life and towards something that felt more authentic, more honest than anything he had experienced in weeks. Sarah Chen was waiting for him in a corner booth, her laptop closed and a digital recorder placed discreetly on the table between them. She was younger than Alexander had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with intelligent eyes and an air of professional competence that immediately put him at ease. "Your Royal Highness," she said as he sat down, "I have to ask, are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with this? Once this story is published, there won't be any way to take it back."
Alexander nodded.
"I understand the consequences, but the truth needs to be told, and you're prepared to provide documentation to support your claims?" Alexander placed a manila envelope on the table, a copy of the evidence his mother had gathered, along with additional materials he had compiled over the past 3 weeks. "Everything you need is in here: bank records, correspondence, transaction details, proof of illegal activities spanning more than a decade." Chen opened the envelope and quickly scanned the contents, her expression growing more serious with each document she reviewed. "This is extraordinary," she said finally. "If these documents are authentic, they implicate not just your father but dozens of other high-ranking officials. The scope of the corruption you're alleging is staggering." "It's all true," Alexander said quietly. "And there's more." "More?" Alexander took a deep breath. "My mother didn't die in an accident. She was murdered to prevent her from exposing this corruption." The words hung in the air between them like a physical force. Chen set down the document she had been reading and stared at him. "Are you saying that King Edmund ordered Queen Isabella's assassination?" "I'm saying that my father admitted as much to me 3 weeks ago. He considered her a threat that needed to be eliminated, so he had her killed." Chen leaned back in her chair, clearly struggling to process the enormity of what Alexander was telling her. "Your Royal Highness, you understand that what you're alleging would be the biggest political scandal in British history? This would bring down the government, possibly end the monarchy altogether."
I understand.
"But justice is more important than institutional stability." They spent the next 4 hours going through every detail of Alexander's story. Chen asked pointed questions, challenged his assumptions, and demanded clarification on points that seemed unclear or potentially unsubstantiated. Alexander found himself appreciating her thoroughness. If he was going to destroy his family and possibly the monarchy itself, he wanted to ensure the story was told accurately and completely. "I'll need time to verify these documents independently," Chen said as they prepared to leave, "and I'll want to interview other sources who might be able to corroborate parts of your account." "How long will that take?" "Several weeks, possibly longer. A story of this magnitude requires absolute accuracy. We can't afford any errors that might give your father's people grounds to discredit the entire investigation." Alexander nodded. Though part of him had hoped for a quicker resolution, the weight of carrying these secrets was becoming unbearable, and every day he spent in his father's presence felt like a betrayal of his mother's memory. "There's something else you should know," Chen said as they stood to leave. "Once I begin making inquiries about this story, word will likely get back to the palace. Your father and his advisors will know that someone is investigating them." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if King Edmund was willing to eliminate one threat to his secrets, he might be willing to eliminate another. You need to be very careful, Your Royal Highness. Your life could be in danger." The warning sent a chill through Alexander, but it also strengthened his resolve. If his father was willing to kill to protect his secrets, then those secrets needed to be exposed regardless of the personal cost. Alexander returned to the palace in the early hours of the morning, slipping back through the service entrance and making his way to his apartments without encountering anyone. But as he opened the door to his study, he found Victoria waiting for him, sitting in his chair with the envelope of original documents in her hands. "We need to talk," she said quietly. Alexander closed the door behind him, his mind racing. Had she discovered his meeting with Chen? Did she know what he was planning? "You've been carrying a terrible burden these past few weeks," Victoria continued, setting the envelope down on his desk. "I can see it in your face, in the way you've been avoiding both your father and me. This knowledge is destroying you, Alexander." "Someone murdered my mother," he said simply. "How am I supposed to carry on as if that doesn't matter?" "By remembering that revenge won't bring her back," Victoria replied, "by understanding that sometimes we have to accept that justice and closure aren't the same thing." Alexander moved to the window, staring out at the pre-dawn darkness. "Is that what you've been telling yourself all these years? That keeping the secret was somehow noble?" "I've been telling myself that protecting you was more important than satisfying my own need for truth." Victoria's voice was soft, almost pleading. "Alexander, I loved Isabella. Her death has haunted me every day for 15 years, but destroying everyone else won't honor her memory.
Won't it?
Alexander turned to face her. She died trying to expose the truth about corruption at the highest levels of government. Finishing what she started seems like exactly the kind of tribute she would have wanted. Victoria stood up and moved closer to him. She died because she was naive about the consequences of her actions. Don't make the same mistake. What consequences? The end of a corrupt system? The possibility that future leaders might actually be held accountable for their actions? The end of constitutional monarchy in Britain, Victoria said firmly. The collapse of a system of government that has provided stability for centuries. Chaos that could take generations to resolve, with ordinary people paying the price for the nobility of your gesture. Alexander had heard these arguments before, from his father, from his own conscience during the dark nights when he questioned his decision to pursue justice. But they no longer carried the same weight they once had. Maybe the system deserves to collapse if this is what it takes to maintain it, he said. Victoria's expression grew desperate. Alexander, please, think about what you're doing. Once you start down this path, there won't be any way back. Your life as you know it will be over. You'll never be king, never have the chance to reform the system from within, never be able to build the kind of monarchy Isabella would have been proud of. I can't build anything on a foundation of lies and murder. Then what do you plan to do? Spend the rest of your life as a pariah, watching from the sidelines as Britain tears itself apart. Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering her question. He hadn't thought much beyond exposing the truth. The personal consequences for himself had seemed less important than finally giving his mother the justice she deserved. I don't know, he admitted, but I know I can't continue living this lie. Victoria moved to his desk and picked up the envelope again. There's another option, she said slowly. What do you mean? Your father is 65 years old. He won't live forever. If you wait, if you bide your time, you could inherit the throne and then use your position as king to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. You could reform the system from within, create the kind of transparent, accountable monarchy that Isabella envisioned, and in the meantime, I just pretend that I don't know my mother was murdered. In the meantime, you focus on becoming the kind of leader who could prevent future tragedies like Isabella's death. Victoria's voice grew more urgent. Alexander, you could honor your mother's memory by building something better, rather than destroying everything she died trying to save. Alexander found himself wavering. Victoria's argument had a certain logic to it. Patient reform might accomplish more than dramatic exposure. But every time he looked at his father, every time he sat through a family dinner or a state function, he felt complicit in covering up Isabella's murder. I've already set things in motion, he said finally. I've spoken to a journalist. She's investigating the evidence. Victoria's face went pale. Alexander, no, you don't understand what you've done. I've done what my mother would have wanted me to do. You've signed your own death warrant, Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. Your father won't allow this story to see the light of day. He can't afford to. Are you saying he'll try to have me killed? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her hands trembling slightly as she considered her answer. I'm saying that your father has spent his entire life protecting the institution of monarchy, and he views threats to that institution as existential challenges that justify any response. She looked up at him with eyes full of fear and sadness. If he eliminated Isabella to protect his secrets, what do you think he'll do to prevent you from exposing them to the world? The implication hit Alexander like a physical blow. His father hadn't just murdered his mother, he was capable of murdering his own son to protect himself. The man who had raised him, who had taught him about duty and service and the sacred responsibility of leadership, would kill him without hesitation if he perceived Alexander as a threat. Then I need to move quickly, Alexander said, before he realizes what's happening. It's too late for that, Victoria said sadly. Your father's security apparatus is far more sophisticated than you realize. They monitor communications, track movements, identify potential threats before they fully develop. If you've spoken to a journalist about this, they already know. As if summoned by her words, there was a soft knock on the study door. Alexander and Victoria froze, staring at each other with expressions of mutual terror. Come in, Alexander called, trying to keep his voice steady. The door opened to reveal Marcus Rothwell, the chief security officer who had first shown Alexander the tunnel footage. But Rothwell's expression was different now. Cold, professional, almost apologetic. Your Royal Highness, Rothwell said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. Lady Victoria, I'm sorry to disturb you at this hour, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention. Alexander felt his pulse racing. Had Chen been compromised? Had the investigation been discovered already? What kind of situation? Alexander asked. Rothwell moved closer, his hand resting casually on what Alexander now realized was a concealed weapon. The kind of situation that requires damage control, Rothwell said quietly. I'm afraid your conversation with Ms. Chen this evening was observed and recorded. His Majesty is most displeased. Victoria stepped protectively in front of Alexander, though they both knew it was a futile gesture. Marcus, she said, surely we can discuss this rationally. Alexander is young. He's emotional about his mother's death. Certainly some accommodation can be reached. Rothwell shook his head sadly. I'm afraid not, Lady Victoria. The risk is too great. His Royal Highness has demonstrated that he cannot be trusted to prioritize institutional stability over personal sentiment. So what happens now? Alexander asked, surprised by how calm his own voice sounded. Now, Rothwell said, producing a syringe from his jacket, we arrange for you to have an unfortunate accident. Something believable, perhaps a fall from your horse during your morning ride, or a climbing mishap during one of your recreational outings. The investigation will be thorough but will ultimately conclude that it was a tragic accident. Alexander looked at the syringe, understanding that it probably contained something that would incapacitate him until a more elaborate death could be staged. Just like his mother, he was about to become a victim of his father's ruthless pragmatism. Wait, Victoria said suddenly. There might be another way. Rothwell paused, the syringe still in his hand. I'm listening. The journalist, Chen. She hasn't published anything yet, has she? She's still in the investigation phase. That's correct. We have people monitoring her activities. She's been making preliminary inquiries, but nothing has been written or submitted for publication. Victoria looked at Alexander with desperate eyes. If you recant your story, if you tell her that you were mistaken or emotionally compromised, she might abandon the investigation. And then? Alexander asked. And then you disappear, Rothwell said matter-of-factly. Not permanently, just relocated. There are facilities where individuals who pose security risks can be housed comfortably, but securely. You would be well cared for, but you would no longer be in a position to threaten state security. Alexander understood what was being offered. A lifetime of imprisonment disguised as protective custody. He would live, but he would never be free, never be able to expose the truth about his mother's death, never be able to honor her memory in the way she deserved. I won't do it, he said firmly. Alexander, please, Victoria pleaded. It's better than the alternative.
Is it?
Spending the rest of my life as a prisoner, knowing that my mother's murderers are living freely while I rot in some comfortable cage. Alexander looked at Rothwell with defiance in his eyes. I'd rather die knowing I tried to do the right thing than live knowing I abandoned it. Rothwell sighed, raising the syringe again. I had hoped you would be more reasonable, Your Royal Highness. This truly is regrettable. Before he could inject Alexander, Victoria suddenly grabbed a heavy crystal paperweight from the desk and struck Rothwell in the head with all her strength. The security chief collapsed to the floor, blood pooling around his skull. My God, Victoria whispered, staring at what she had done. I've killed him. Alexander knelt beside Rothwell, checking for a pulse. No, he's still alive, but he's unconscious. We need to get out of here immediately. Where can we go? Your father controls everything. The police, the security services, even most of the press. There's nowhere we can hide. Alexander stood up, his mind racing through possibilities. There's one place, he said finally. Somewhere my father can't reach us, at least not immediately. Where? The old tunnel system. The same place where my mother met you that last night. It's outside the normal security perimeter, and most people have forgotten it exists. Alexander moved to his desk and grabbed the envelope of evidence. We can hide there while Chen publishes her story. Once it's public, my father won't be able to simply make us disappear. Victoria looked uncertain. Alexander, even if we can hide for a few days, what then? This won't end with one newspaper story. Your father has resources and allies we can't even imagine. He'll find a way to discredit the evidence, to paint you as mentally unstable, or worse. Maybe. But at least the truth will be out there. People will know what really happened to my mother. Alexander moved toward the door, then stopped and looked back at Victoria. You don't have to come with me. You could stay here. Tell them that Rothwell surprised you, that you never knew what I was planning. Victoria smiled sadly. Do you really think your father would believe that? Do you think he would trust me to keep quiet about what I've seen and heard? She shook her head. No, Alexander. I made my choice when I struck down Rothwell. I'm with you now, for better or worse. They slipped out of the study and made their way through the darkened corridors of the palace. avoiding the main thoroughfares and security stations. Alexander had explored these passages extensively as a child, and muscle memory guided him through routes that few adults knew existed. As they descended into the basement levels and approached the entrance to the tunnel system, Alexander felt a strange sense of completion. His mother had walked these same passages on her last night, carrying evidence of corruption and hoping to create a better world. Now he was following in her footsteps, carrying the same evidence and the same hope. The tunnel felt different than it had during his previous visit with Rothwell. Without the security chief's flashlights and equipment, the space was darker, more primitive, more like the medieval hiding place it had originally been designed to be. But there was also something peaceful about it, a sense of sanctuary, of being finally free from the elaborate performance that had defined his entire life. "What happens now?" Victoria asked, as they settled into the chamber where Isabella had spent her final hours. "Now we wait," Alexander said, checking his phone to ensure he could still reach Chen if necessary. "And we hope that the truth is stronger than the forces trying to suppress it." As dawn began to break over London, casting faint light through the ventilation shafts that connected the tunnel to the world above, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks, a sense of peace. He was finally honoring his mother's memory, finally standing up for the principles she had died defending. Whether he would live to see the results of his decision remained to be seen. But for the first time since learning the truth about Isabella's death, Alexander felt as if he was truly his mother's son. Outside, the palace was beginning to stir with the activities of another day. Soon, Rothwell would be discovered, and the hunt for the missing prince would begin. But for now, in the darkness of the tunnel where his mother had made her final stand, Alexander felt closer to her than he had since her death 15 years ago. The truth was finally going to be told, whatever the cost. And that, Alexander believed, was exactly what Queen Isabella would have wanted.